Bonds of brotherhood between the Ansars and Muhajirun. The Prophet established bonds of brotherhood between the Muhajirun and the Ansar, putting them under an agreement and obligation to mutual welfare, benevolence and assistance. Each Ansari took a Muhajir brother. The former sometimes went so far as to give his Muhajir brother half of whatever he possessed in the form of houses, assets, lands and groves. Such was the enthusiasm of the Ansars to share everything with their brothers in faith that they divided everything into two parts to draw lots for allocating their share. In most cases, they tried to give the Muhajirun the fairer portion of their property. An Ansari would say to his emigrant brother, "Behold, I shall divide my possessions into two halves." The Muhajir, who was often an expert in commerce, would refuse and would answer, "May Allah bless you in your family and your possessions. Just inform me of where the market is?" The Ansar were magnanimous and self-denying, and the Muhajir forbearing, self-reliant. Covenant between the Muslims and the Jews. Shortly thereafter, the Prophet got a written document, which bound the Muhajirun and the Ansars to a friendly agreement. The covenant made the Jews a party to the treaty that guaranteed them the freedom of their rights and obligations. Hypocrisy raises its head in Medina. There was no motivation for deception and double-dealing in Mecca. Islam was helpless, harried and harassed there. Moreover, none had the power to turn the tide in Mecca, nor could anyone think of gaining any worldly advantage by accepting Islam. Giving one's faith to Islam meant one was prepared to set oneself at odds with the whole of Mecca and to risk one's life. Only one venturesome in spirit and having the courage of convictions could bear to play with the fire of hostility raging in the hearts of Islam's enemies. Only a man of mettle could take a chance with his life and property, future and prosperity. In Mecca, there were not two powers equally poised. The heathens were brought out forcefully by the Quran in its elegant style. And remember, when you were few and reckoned feeble in the land, and were in fear lest men should extirpate you. When Islam found a new safe haven in Medina and the Prophet and his companions were blessed with peace and stability, Islam began to prosper. It brought into existence a new society, a new brotherhood of men united by the consciousness of a common outlook in life and common aspirations as expressed by the Islamic principles. The dazzling spectacle of an idealistic commonwealth meant a complete break with the past, for the change was so radical so as to induce the faint-hearted to sail under false colors. This was quite logical, or rather based on the natural instincts of those who could not cope with the revolutionary movement. Also, hypocrisy shows up its mettle only where two contending powers or principles are pitted against each other, for the indecisive and the spineless are always wavering, swinging from one end to another. They are always of two minds, hesitant, and never able to take a final decision. Often they hang together with one of the two contenders, profess loyalty and try to go along with it, but their self-solicitude and vested interests do not permit them to cling on and sacrifice and endure with it. The fear that the other party might recover its strength someday does not elude them, nor are they ever able to make a total break with their past for the sake of new ideas or ideals. This is a delicate state of disloyalty or infirmity of purpose portrayed graphically by the Quran as follows. And among the mankind is he who worshippeth Allah upon a narrow marge, so that if good befalleth him, he is content therewith, but if a trial befalleth him, he falleth away utterly. He losseth both the world and the hereafter. That is the sheer loss. Quran 22:11. The distinctive trait of this group is delineated in another verse which says, swaying between this and that, belonging neither to these nor to those. Quran 8:26. The leader of the hypocrites, drawn from the ranks of Aws and Khazraj as well as the Jews of Medina, was Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul. Exhausted by the Battle of Bu'th that was fought between the Aws and Khazraj around 5 years before the arrival of the Prophet of Allah in Medina, both these tribes had agreed to recognize Abdullah bin Ubay as their leader. By the time Islam came to gain adherents in Medina, preparations were already being made to formally crown him as the king of the city. When he saw that the people were being won over by Islam, quickly and in large numbers at that, he became so annoyed that his resentment grew to torture his mind. Ibn Hisham writes, when the Prophet came to Medina, the leader there was Abdullah bin Ubay Salul al-Afi. None of his own people contested his authority, and Aws and Khazraj never rallied to any one man before Islam as they did to him. Abdullah bin Ubay's people had made a sort of jeweled diadem to crown him and make him their king when Allah sent his Prophet to them. So when his people deserted him in favor of Islam, he was filled with enmity, realizing that the Prophet had deprived him of his kingship. However, when he saw that his people were determined to go over the fold of Islam, he did too, though unwillingly, retaining his enmity and dissimulation. All those persons who had a suppressed desire concealed in their hearts or were ambitious for prestige, power, or authority, felt cut to the heart at the success of religion that welded the Muhajreen and the Anssar as two bodies with one soul. A religion that inspired them with a dedication to the Prophet, which was even more intense than one had for one's own father, son, and wife. Hatred and ill will against the Prophet filled their hearts, and they started hatching up plots against Muslims. This was how a coalition of the double-faced discontented ones came into existence within the Islamic world, who were in reality worthless and just a parcel of the Muslim society. People know better than a lowly but dangerous snake in the grass that Muslims had to be even more careful with than to Allah's openly acknowledged enemies. This is why the Quran repeatedly exposes their hypocrisy and warns against their concealed designs. Their surreptitious intrigues continued to undermine the stability of the Islamic society, and hence the works on the life of the Prophet cannot do otherwise than divulge their hidden agenda and activities. Beginning of the Jewish animosity. After initially maintaining an attitude of indifference and neutrality, the Jews gradually began to show their hatred and rancor against Islam. In the beginning they steered a middle course between the Muslims and the pagans and the Arab tribes of Mecca and Medina, or were rather inclined towards the Muslims. The Jews of Medina had, in the beginning, felt closer to the Muslims, having found a striking resemblance of their own religious beliefs to such fundamental teachings of Islam, such as prophecy and prophethood, belief in the hereafter, unity of Allah, and their own faith. This is notwithstanding the differences in detail, as well as the fact that undue veneration of certain prophets and adoption of pagan customs through their age-old association with heathens had beclouded their pristine faith in monotheism. It was thus reasonably expected that if they did not side with the Muslims, they would at least remain non-partisan. At any rate, Islam testified the divine origin of scriptures and called upon the Muslims to have faith in all the Hebrew prophets. This was later to become a fundamental tenet of faith in Islam, as affirmed by the succeeding Quranic verse. Each one believeth in Allah and His angels and His scriptures and His messengers, we make no distinction between any of His messengers. Quran 2:285. Would that the Jews had understood the conciliatory mood of Islam. Had it been so, the history of Islam, or rather that of the world, would have been entirely different today. Then Islam would not have faced the impediments it had to encounter in the dissemination of its message, especially in its initial stages, resulting from the strife between the early Muslims armed only with the strength of their faith and the powerful and influential, educated as well as wealthy Jews of old. This enmity can be attributed to two causes. One of these was envy and covetousness, bigotry and narrow-mindedness. Had there been a political leader in place of the Prophet of Allah, he would have tactfully met the Jews halfway, especially in view of their importance in the tangled politics of Medina. Even if it were not possible to placate the Jews, a national leader would have at least avoided setting them at odds against him by concealing his ultimate objective. But, as messenger of Allah, he had to proclaim the truth, interdict what was forbidden, and countenance no vestiges of evil and peccantliness. He had been saddled with the responsibility to deliver the message of Allah to the whole world throughout all races and nations, including the Jews and Christians, as well as to invite them to accept Islam regardless of its costs or consequences. This was really the path taken by all the prophets of old, a distinctive mark only akin to them, one which is in no way followed and cherished by politicians and national leaders alike. But, this was what the Jews detested most, for it struck at the very roots of their beliefs and outlook, leading them to become hostile to Islam and the Muslims. They gave up their earlier policy of steering the middle course and decided to oppose Islam in every way possible, openly as well as through intrigues. Israel Welfenson, quoted here, has been frank and straightforward in his analysis of the reasons for ill will between the Jews and the Muslims. If the teachings of the Prophet had been restricted only to the denunciation of idolatry and the Jews had not been called upon to acknowledge his prophethood, there would have been no conflict between the Jews and the Muslims. The Jews might have then commended and acclaimed the Prophet's doctrine of monotheism and backed him or even supported him with men and other material resources until he had succeeded in destroying the idols and effacing polytheistic creed rampant in Arabia. But this depended on the condition that he left the Jews and their religion well enough alone and not demanded the acceptance of the new prophethood. For the bent of Jewish temperament cannot take kindly to anything that tries to seduce it from its faith. They can never acknowledge any prophet save one belonging to Bani Israel. The Jews were further shocked and agitated when some of their learned rabbis like Abdullah Salam, whom they held in high esteem, embraced Islam. The Jews could never imagine that a man of his stature and erudition would accept the new faith. Thus, this only served to make the Jews all the more annoyed and jealous of the religion. The animosity of the Jews against Islam was not such as to be content with defying or putting up a bold front against it. Although Muslims shared their faith in monotheism, it was only but logical as well as reasonable to expect that if the Jews were called upon to give their verdict on the Prophet's faith vis-a-vis the idolatrous creed of the Quraysh, they would speak well of Islam. They would cite the soundness of its belief in one God against the multiplicity of deities taken for granted by the pagans of Mecca. But their hatred against Islam had so infuriated them that they were even willing to deny that gospel truth. Once, when some of the rabbis went to Mecca, the Quraysh asked them whether their idolatrous religion or that of the Prophet was better, to which they answered, "Your religion is better off than his and you are more rightly guided than them." The comment of Dr. Israel Welfenson on the reply given by the Jews is worth repeating here. But, surely, the thing for which they deserve to be reproached and which would be painful to all those who believe in the unity of Allah, whether they be Jews and pagan Qurayshites wherein they had given preference to the religion of the Quraysh over what had been brought by the Prophet of Islam. The same writer further goes on to say, "Deception, mendicity and similar means for entrapping the enemy have been sanctioned by the nations for achieving a military objective in times of warfare. Yet the Jews ought not to have committed the grievous mistake of declaring roundly that adoration of idols was preferable to the Islamic faith in the unity of Allah. Not even if they feared to miss the distinction by doing so. For Bani Israel had, in the name of their forefathers, held aloft the banner of Allah's unity for ages amidst heathen nations of the old, had all along braved innumerable trials and tribulations and gone through fire and blood for its sake. It was their bounden duty to sacrifice their lives and whatever they held dear to humble the idolaters and polytheists." Al-Yahud fi Balad al-Arab, page 142. As a matter of fact, the situation was sufficiently serious so as to warrant a reference in the Quran. "Hast you not seen those unto whom a portion of the scripture hath been given, how they believe in idols and false deities, and how they say those, idolaters, who disbelieve, these are more rightly guided than those who believe." Quran 4:51.